Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me online today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person and hear other people's presentations, but my contact details are in the end of this presentation. And yeah, I welcome any questions or any kind of further discussions that this talk might spark. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Story Features at Royal Holloway, University of London. And the work that I'll be presenting today on young people's experiences of virtual group music making is the work that I've conducted during my PhD at the University of Sussex. So the main focus of this work was to investigate whether virtual music making environments can replicate young people's psychological experiences of in-person music making. So before the pandemic, I've conducted research with in-person music sessions, identifying psychological outcomes and mechanisms experienced during these music making sessions. And then the pandemic hit and all of these sessions moved online. So I thought that was a good opportunity to conduct some research investigating the potential of virtual music making environments and to what extent they can replicate the psychological outcomes and mechanisms. And a particular focus of mine, particular interest was also around what I observed for in-person music sessions, which was the fact that a lot of people described the social element and the significance of making music together, being part of this group and making something together musically that was described as a driver of the sense of connectedness amongst the group members, and that was something that I was particularly interested in, and whether that can be replicated in virtual spaces. So as I said, this is the work that I've conducted before the pandemic. This is the paper that outlines the psychological mechanisms and outcomes that I have identified working with these in-person music sessions in a model that I'll outline on the next slide or two. In order to do that, I've worked with inclusive projects. Two of those inclusive projects were music spaces, particularly focusing on young people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and the other two were inclusive ensembles, particularly focusing on young people with special educational needs or disabilities. And that was all during before the pandemic. So working with creative practitioners, young people and their parents and carers, using qualitative and quantitative methods such as surveys, focus groups, interviews, session reports, to come up with this model here, which kind of model of young people's psychological experiences of music spaces. And at the top, you can see kind of what we name areas of development. So like the surface level outcomes of engagement with music spaces. And that includes the outcomes that we identified were emotional competence, so greater understanding of one's emotions and greater emotional regulation, sense of confidence, greater sense of confidence as a result of participating in sessions like this, and also greater social competence, so greater social skills, essentially. And below the surface, we can see the psychological mechanisms that are driving these changes. And at the bottom, we can see kind of the aspects of the environment, of these musical environments that were driving these mechanisms. So it's kind of going from the bottom to the top. And just to kind of describe more generally, so if we start at the bottom left, we identified that kind of the music making aspect was really important in terms of worked as a really important medium of self-expression and self-exploration for the young people, which led to kind of greater self-awareness and self-understanding. And in combination with the fact that these sessions were person-centered or youth-led, this really nurtured young people a sense of autonomy, that sense of freedom of choice, but also the fact that they made something of their own, made their own music, really nurtured that sense of ownership of one's creativity. And that was kind of what we named like an intrapersonal mechanisms, intrapersonal processes, leading to these intrapersonal outcomes, which we identified as social, emotional competence. And then on the right-hand side of this model, we've got interpersonal aspects of these music sessions. So more in the context of others, not from within, but kind of more externally. And if we look at what we color-coded in red, we can see that the fact that the opportunities for performing and the support of the staff members really enable young people to nurture that sense of competence, challenge, give them validation and challenge potential previous negative self-beliefs, which then in turn led to greater sense of confidence. And then finally, as I touched upon earlier, that aspect of making music together, creating something as a group together, being part of something bigger, leading to greater sense of connectedness with others, greater kind of inclusive, supportive climate, which in turn, within this climate, allowed young people to practice social skills and feel comfortable and accepted, leading to greater social competence of the young people. So kind of separating the two into inter and intrapersonal mechanisms and outcomes of engagement. So this is the work that we've done before the pandemic. And as I said earlier, then the pandemic hit and all of a sudden, all of these music sessions moved online. I'm sorry if this photograph might be triggering for some of you. I think we're all glad that life has kind of moved back to in person, but that was the temporary solution that lots of these music groups were left with. And something that I thought was really fascinating was the fact that literally all of those 4 groups that I worked with for in-person sessions, they all found a way of meeting virtually, of meeting online. And that is just so impressive, especially considering that even schools weren't meeting online at some point and parents had to homeschool their children. It was these music sessions that just continued happening virtually. And just speaking with other, kind of talking and looking at the qualitative data, it was one of the only activities that persisted during the pandemic and didn't manage to move online, which is quite fascinating, and I think speaks for itself in terms of the importance of music in these young people's lives. But as I said earlier, I thought that was if anything, an interesting opportunity to study virtual spaces and to investigate whether these virtual music environments can replicate these psychological experiences, can replicate these outcomes and mechanisms that we identified in the in-person research. So we continued working with the 2 music spaces and 2 inclusive ensembles that took part in the in-person research, and connected with other virtual music activities as well. So in total, we worked with 13 virtual projects, and this work no longer focused only on inclusive spaces, but also on mainstream ensembles. And again, we worked with creative practitioners, young people, as well as parents and carers. But this presentation will focus on 2 aspects of data collections we've done. There is a whole other aspect that we've done with parents and young people, and more of that information can be found in the paper with the same title as this presentation. So just letting you know that there is even more work. But looking at 2 aspects. So the first one, we worked with session reports, so investigating the outcomes, surface level outcomes of virtual spaces. We worked with reports that staff members completed after each session, And that's something that they've been doing since before the pandemic. So we were able to directly compare the session reports for young people before and during COVID. And these session reports were completed by staff members in relation to the whole group. So there were 2 open-ended questions about the significant events during the sessions, and also quantitative questions asking kind of on a group level, what was the general sense of well-being in the group at that session that day, for example. And there were a list of questions looking at interpersonal outcomes and intrapersonal outcomes, so personal outcomes and social outcomes. And we're able to compare these sessions that were happened in person and sessions that happened virtually. And we can see on the left-hand side, we've got intrapersonal outcomes, so personal outcomes, what we named emotional competence in that model. And we can see that overall, it is above the number 3, which was the neutral option in the rating. So the ratings range between 1 and 5, and 1 was negative and 5 was positive. The very typical scale in psychology research. And we can see that overall, all of these ratings were actually positive. We can also see that in relation to intrapersonal outcomes, virtual music sessions actually scored higher than in-person sessions. And this could be for 2 reasons. One would be that the fact that these virtual music sessions carried a higher significance in relation to young people's other life circumstances, because as I said, the school wasn't being continued. Young people were at home all the time, their other activities weren't continued, like sports activities. So there was literally, for a lot of people, this was the only session, the only activity that they had. So that was really, it seemed like that was just extremely significant for them. And another possible explanation could also be the fact that some of these sessions were sessions that we worked with. Some of these sessions continued, so it might be kind of a continued benefit of exposure to these environments. So kind of young people just growing in these intrapersonal outcomes over time of their engagement. And yeah, just timely, the in-person was more before, slightly earlier, and then virtual was slightly after. So that could also be another explanation. And if we look at the social outcomes, we can see that while they were overall positive, we can see that they also were replicated and satisfied in virtual environments. They stayed the same as in person, so they weren't any higher. But yeah, overall, this kind of concludes or suggests that virtual environments were successful at satisfying young people's interpersonal and intrapersonal psychological outcomes to a similar level than the in-person music sessions. And then looking at the psychological mechanisms, we observed the sessions using this need-relevant instructor behavior scale, which was a checklist, an observational checklist. And this observational checklist was actually based on the self-determination theory, which suggests that as long as the 3 basic psychological needs are satisfied in environments, that will lead to higher sense of well-being in its participants. And these 3 basic psychological needs were needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, which mirrored, if we go back very quickly, we can see that mirrored the 3 or 4 mechanisms that we identified. So autonomy, something that we identified to be autonomous engagement, and then competence, and then relatedness. So with this, apologies for moving through slides very quickly. So with the use of this observation scale, we were able to quantify the satisfaction of these 3 mechanisms in virtual environments. So the way it worked it was myself and two other research assistants who took turns. So there was always myself and another rater. And we observed these virtual music sessions and had a list of behaviors that were either need supporting, or need taughting. So they were either satisfying or dissatisfying in relation to these needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And this was done every 2 minutes. So if these behaviors happened within the 2 minutes, they were recorded. If not, they weren't recorded. And this happened throughout the session in the 15-minute chunks. So usually a session was an hour long, so there would be 4 chunks within a session. And at the end of these 15-minute chunks, we also rated the general sense of support, of how supporting or taughting the environment was in relation to autonomy, competence, or relatedness. So we recorded the frequency of these behaviors and also a general sense of how satisfied or dissatisfied these needs were in that 15-minute period. And as we were recording these behaviors, we also recorded instances of music making. So at what 2-minute period there was any instance of music making. I hope that makes sense. Please feel free to get in touch and I can show you, do a visual representation of how this observation checklist worked. Just want to highlight that this was always done with 2 raters, 2 independent raters, and the inter-rater reliability was satisfactory. We calculated a few different ones. So again, please do get in touch if you would like to see the numbers or look at the paper. So this then enabled us to answer the question of whether these psychological mechanisms were replicated in virtual environments. And we can see that overall, all 3, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, were rated in a positive way. So they were, the mean of across all of these chunks was significantly above 0, which was the neutral point, and then the negative indicates a need taughting. So we can see that overall, all 3 mechanisms of autonomy, competence, and relatedness were also present in virtual environments. We can see that autonomy was slightly higher than competence and relatedness, but overall, we can conclude that virtual environments were able to replicate the mechanisms of the 3 mechanisms of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And then looking at the third and final research question that we had, which was whether these virtual music spaces and the instances of virtual group music making, such as turn taking, or all playing at once, or playing to a backing track, all being muted and Zoom playing to a backing track, were there instances like that led to a higher sense of relatedness as they were reported to do in in-person music sessions. So what we did is we looked at the observed recordings of the group music making instances and the overall sense of relatedness that we coded for. And we did not see a direct relationship between those two. So on instances where people were doing, on instances of group music making activities, there weren't any higher ratings of relatedness. However, we saw that this relationship was indirect and was actually mediated by supporting staff behaviors. So on instances of group music making in virtual environments, this actually meant that staff members were more supportive. So we're acting in a more supportive way, which then in turn led to a higher sense of relatedness observed in this space. So I think this is really interesting because it shows that despite the fact that this group music making and this connecting element of group music making observed in in-person sessions cannot be directly replicated in virtual environments, there was still an indirect connection between the two. And there's a lot of further research that could be done in relation to that, I would like to now go back to in-person music sessions and measure and do exactly the same observations and see whether there maybe is if I would like to hypothesize that there might be a direct connection between instances of group music making and sense of relatedness or connectedness. But yeah, that's very much a curiosity for further research for me. And I think, yeah, it's really interesting from the perspective of like what mechanisms are there that are underlying this special side of music that really bonds people through instances of group music making. So yeah, overall, I think I could conclude that virtual music environments were quite successful at replicating the psychological experiences of young people in person, as observed in in-person music environments. Thank you so much for listening. These are my contact details. Feel free to get in touch. I'm really happy to discuss this project further. And I just wanted to finish and acknowledge all of these different partners and funders that supported my PhD in this particular research project. Thank you so much for listening. And yes, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.